What really makes a civilization great? And on the flip side, what makes it fall apart? Today, we're diving into the provocative answers found in a really influential book called Islam and the World. We're going to follow its epic historical argument, one that totally re-examines how we think about power, about faith, and about society itself.
So how do you even begin to measure something like that? Is it about the huge buildings they leave behind, their armies, how much gold they had? Or is the real yardstick something else entirely? Something, a bit deeper? That is the question at the very heart of the entire argument we're about to unpack.
Well, for the author of Islam and the World, the answer isn't about all that material stuff. Not at all. It's about a civilization's moral and spiritual core. So in this explainer, we're going to walk through the book's central idea, which is basically this dramatic retelling of world history. And it all starts with the author's diagnosis of what the world looked like before Islam.
All right, so the author kicks things off by painting this picture of a world in just deep crisis, a world that's totally adrift with no moral compass to guide it. And to really make his case for why a change was needed, he first has to diagnose what he sees as this profound sickness infecting the great civilizations of the 6th century. First up, he takes a look at Persia, and what he argues is that it was a society of just these wild extremes. On one hand, you had people practicing intense self-denial, but on the other, you had movements like Mazdakism. Now, according to the book, this movement called for sharing women and wealth, which the author says led to nothing short of sexual anarchy and erotic crisis. Okay, from Persia, the author's critique moves to India. Here the focus is all on the social structure. He points to the Manu Shastra as the rule book, so to speak, that locked in this really rigid caste system. And his argument is that this system basically decided your entire worth the moment you were born, creating a society that was just built on this deep and supposedly divinely approved inequality. And then, of course, there was Rome. According to the book, the problem with the Roman Empire wasn't just a few corrupt officials here and there. No, its very foundation was rotten. He calls it, and I'm quoting here, a device for the enrichment of a small class of people by the exploitation of mankind. Basically, entire nations were treated as nothing more than resources, just there to be squeezed dry for the benefit of a tiny ruling class.
So, to put it mildly, the author's view of the pre-Islamic world is incredibly bleak. And this quote just captures that diagnosis perfectly. It describes a world in total moral decay, run by powers that were completely out of control, both irrational and destructive. So, after diagnosing the sickness, the author then presents what he sees as the cure. And this is where the next part of the book comes in. The argument he makes is that Islam wasn't just another religion. It was a complete, game-changing solution to this worldwide crisis he's just laid out.
What the author describes is this absolutely fundamental shift in values. He draws a sharp line between the era he calls Jahiliyyah, which is the Arabic term for an age of ignorance, and the new principles brought by Islam. So where the old world was all about tribalism, revenge, and materialism, he argues that Islam brought in a whole new playbook centered on brotherhood, piety, forgiveness, and justice for everyone.
And according to the book, this wasn't just some idea on paper. It was a total top-to-bottom social transformation. It started by re-establishing the unity of God. From there, a new kind of community was built, one that brought together people from all these different diverse backgrounds. He points to individuals like Umar, who went from being a simple camel herder to the leader of this incredible empire, as a perfect example of how radically people and society were changed.
And this quote from an eyewitness at the time really paints a picture of the unique character the author was talking about. Horsemen by day and ascetics by night. They weren't just warriors, and they weren't just monks. They were both. Disciplined and skilled, but also deeply spiritual. And the author argues that it was this very combination that was the secret sauce, the real engine behind their success.
But of course, as history shows us, no civilization lasts forever. So the next part of the author's story traces this huge historical arc of the Muslim world, from what he calls its golden age of glory, all the way to its eventual stagnation and decline.
So this timeline here really lays out the author's view of that history. He charts this clear path, you see? It starts with the prophetic era and the rightly guided caliphs. Then you have this long stretch from the 8th to the 13th century that he calls the era of Muslim glory. But then comes a huge, devastating setback, the sacking of Baghdad in 1258. There's a bit of a comeback, a new hope with the rise of the Ottoman Turks. But the author's argument is that from the 18th century onward, the Muslim world fell into a period of stagnation and decadence.
So what went wrong? Why the decline? Well, the author points to what he sees as a critical failure, and this quote really gets to the heart of it. He says that the later empires, like the Ottomans, isolated themselves completely from the outside world. They basically just shut their eyes to all the changes happening around them. In his view, their downfall was self-inflicted. They got complacent and lost that dynamic spark that had made them so successful in the first place. All right, so that brings us to the modern era. Now that he's laid out his argument for the decline of the Muslim world, the author turns his focus to the civilization that rose to fill that vacuum, the West. And in his analysis, this is where we find a new and maybe even more dangerous crisis for all of humanity. So, to understand his critique of the modern West, you have to follow his logic on its ideological roots. He basically traces it in a few steps. Step 1, Greek civilization, which he says was all about the body and the senses. Step 2, Roman civilization, with its materialism and its hunger for power. Step 3, he argues that an extreme form of Christian monasticism then swung the pendulum way to the other side, leading to this big backlash. And that backlash, step 4, was a full-on revolt against religion, which gave birth to the secular, materialist world we see today. Now, to back up this critique, the author actually pulls in quotes from Western thinkers who were critical of their own society. He uses this one from Alexis Carrel, who observed that, for all its advances, modern civilization has failed in developing men of sufficient intelligence and audacity to guide it. This is a huge point for the author. He's arguing that despite all our technology, we're failing to produce leaders who are actually wise enough to manage it all. So let's just quickly summarize the book's main critiques of the modern West. First, godlessness, a civilization that he says just isn't concerned with spiritual things. Second, materialism. He calls it the gospel of acquisition, where making money is the most important thing. Third, aggressive nationalism, this idea of dividing humanity up into these competing, godless states. And finally, moral perversion, where the state's job becomes regulating vice instead of actually trying to stop it. So if that's his diagnosis of the modern world, what's the real cost? What have we actually lost along the way? The author spends a lot of time on this question, and his answer is that our real loss isn't about money or technology. It's something much deeper, something spiritual and moral. Yeah, his central argument is pretty stark. He believes that mankind has essentially traded away its soul. What we've really lost, he says, is that sense of piety, that connection to community, and any kind of higher purpose beyond just getting more stuff. And these are the very things, he argues, that used to be the bedrock of a healthy society. And this really highlights the stark contrast the author is trying to draw between the past and the present. You know, he describes a past where your conscience was valued more than your life itself, where honesty was everything and learning was seen as a sacred duty. And he compares that to the present, a world where, in his view, your intellect is just another thing to sell, success is only measured by your bank account, and the very idea of contentment has become almost meaningless. Okay, so after this huge historical deep dive and this pretty intense critique, where does that leave us? Well, the final section of the book actually isn't about despair. It's a really powerful and urgent call to action. It's his prescription for the future. And he uses this powerful metaphor to make his final point. He says to imagine humanity as a caravan that's completely lost its way, and the guide, which represents the modern secular worldview, is just reckless, leading everyone down a dark and dangerous path. So for him, the solution is obvious. You have to change the guide to save the caravan. From his point of view, the only real way out is a return to faith and divine guidance. And the book closes with this poetic, almost haunting call to action. It's a direct plea, really, for the spiritual inheritors of that original message to rise up and take on the task of rebuilding. It's a powerful final thought that really sums up the book's entire message. The world, as the author sees it, is broken, and the only way to fix it is to build it again on a foundation of faith.